I don't care what you look like or what you think. I don't care what you do or where you're from. All I care about is that gift hidden inside you. And all I want to do is help it come alive. Because where we're going, we're going to need a lot of heroes. For the record, 10,000 Heroes is brought to you by Momentum Lab. The point of Momentum Lab is to turn idealists into impactors by aligning your dreams and aspirations with success in every area of your life today. Momentum Lab is like a playground for your highest self. We take your dreams seriously and help you remove any blocks to realizing them. We do this through courses, virtual events, in-person events, and our signature year-long accelerator. To join our world, engage in dialogue, meet up in person, and just blow your mind, sign up at momentumlab.com. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of 10,000 Heroes. I'm your host, Ankur Shah Delight, and today's episode is another one in the series on anger, or on integrating tools from the red portfolio, as Jeff Salzman would say, kind of like warrior consciousness that we grew through as individuals and as a society, and is alive in all of us still. And what can we use from it is the inquiry here. So as part of previous conversations with Jeff Salzman and John Giuliano, I believe, nonviolent civil disobedience came up, Gandhi and civil disobedience. And so I got Professor Nico Slate, an old friend of mine, who is professor of history at Carnegie Mellon, I think actually the head of the Department of History. And I just read his biography, which I hadn't done in a long time. It turns out Nico has written a lot of books. So if you want to read any books about Martin Luther King or Gandhi, he is your man. But today we're just asking him about the role of anger in the civil rights movement and in Gandhi and civil disobedience. And he goes there, and then he gets into like the role of anger in our lives as parents, and then brings it all the way back to satyagraha, Gandhi's main technique of civil disobedience. So thank you, Nico, and welcome back to the show. So I'm really stoked for you to join us again, Nico. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you. And the question I want to get into today is, using your historical expertise as a historian of nonviolent civil disobedience movements like Gandhi and Dr. King, what do you think, or what have you seen the role of anger? So this is going back to that podcast with Jeff Salzman. What is the role of anger in those movements? And also that question of activity versus passivity in those movements.
Maybe I'll start with Gandhi's preferred term of choice for nonviolent civil disobedience. You know this already, Ankur, but he liked to call it satyagraha. Yeah. And that word is coming together of the word sat or satyam for truth, and agraha, which is usually translated as holding firm. So for Gandhi, the process of nonviolent civil disobedience was a truth act. It was a struggle to make real the higher truths that he aspired to make them real in the world. And that was a messy process. And I think although Gandhi could sometimes be a bit of an idealist or a perfectionist, I think if we had him with us on this call, I think he would admit that the truth is not always rosy, and that in fact the truth of the human experience is full of a range of emotions, fear, sadness, grief, and certainly anger, as well as, of course, love, hope, all the things that we usually ascribe or see as good. So if nonviolent civil disobedience is ultimately about seeking out the truth and making it manifest in the world, then I feel like people are called to acknowledge and in some way grapple with the range of emotions that are part of the human experience, and especially a part of movements for social change. Because of course, people don't put huge amounts of time and effort and risk their lives to change something in the world if they aren't deeply upset about the state of how things are. If they aren't upset with the status quo, then things aren't going to happen. So was anger a part of Gandhian civil disobedience? Was it part of the civil rights movement? Absolutely. No question about it. But then I think the next question for me anyway is, well, how then do you move from a place of being deeply upset and angry with the state of the world to a form of protest that aims to achieve the kind of society we want to live in? And I would say that's a society in which all emotions are still respected, but one in which we're able to engage each other in respectful and ultimately loving forms of action. So if a civil disobedience protest is not just moved by anger, but also is shaped by anger, it's ultimately confrontational in a way that is harmful to other human beings, then I would say, and I think Gandhi would say, that it's falling short of the nonviolent ideal. So if we start by respecting our anger and recognizing that we're moved by a range of emotions, including, again, other emotions that are often categorized as fear, things like, as negative, things like fear or other so-called bad emotions. We recognize those to some degree. We embrace them. We acknowledge that they're part of the human experience. But I do think there's some kind of a transformation that has to occur when you're bringing those into a struggle, because otherwise I think a struggle will become violent, whether in the form of, guns and rocks, or in some kind of less overt form of violence that can ultimately be just as destructive. And this is the last thing I'll say, that I think one of the great legacies of both the Gandhian civil disobedience campaigns that were such a part of India's independence movement and of the civil rights movement in this country, one of the great legacies of those movements was that they were able to live out within the movement itself the kind of society that they hoped to achieve. Now, not perfectly. There are all sorts of ways that people fell short because, again, they're human beings. But to a remarkable degree, they were able to create within the movement itself the kind of world that they hoped would exist. And that was a world in which, sure, people were angry, but also in which people could sit down and talk to each other and argue things out and get very heated, but then in the end of the day still sing "We Shall Overcome" together and have a meal and come together and love each other, so that anger was a part of things, but also not the defining core of those movements.
Yeah, so maybe the distinction I could try to crystallize from that overview or that introduction is that anger and fear and whatever else would drive us to action, but not shape how we acted.
I like that crystallization. I would only add that I think fear or anger alone wouldn't be enough to create a movement. You also have to have hope and love. You have to have both. Mm-hmm. And that ultimately the goal is to then take that hope and love and maybe, if we're thinking visually, sort of mix it in with the anger and the fear in a way that leads us to positive action and leads us ultimately to fighting against injustice, but in a way that embodies the world that we want to live in.
Beautifully put. Thank you, Nico.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm continually amazed by how civil rights activists, when they were talking to each other, were able to fiercely disagree about everything from tomorrow's tactics to the bigger picture goal that everyone was fighting for. There were deep disagreements within the civil rights movement over every possible question. And yet they were able to respect each other and to recognize each other as human beings. And the great historian and sociologist Charles Payne, who wrote my favorite book about the civil rights movement, it's a book called "I've Got the Light of Freedom," and I recommend it to everyone. In that book, one of his main arguments is that part of it is a cultural tradition that comes out of the African American community, particularly in the American South, where people were able to recognize each other as people first. And so I might strongly disagree with you. I might think that everything you're saying and doing is wrong. But in the end of the day, I'm going to recognize you as a human being in God's image. Some of it, I think, is certainly religiously informed. I'm going to recognize you as a human being in God's image, and I'm going to find ways to respect you. And you see this when you look at the civil rights workshops that are at the core of my current historical research. You find these amazing moments where people are just heatedly disagreeing about something like, for example, the role of nonviolence as it relates to armed self-defense, right? That's a heated debate within the movement. Many people are strongly supportive of armed self-defense, and people argue it out, and then they pause and they sing together. And the singing doesn't make everything right. It's not as if all of a sudden by the end of a verse of, we shall overcome, or, some other civil rights ballad that everyone comes together and agrees. No, the disagreements are still there, but people are able to work through them together. And I think that's really important in our world right now, because there are a lot of divisions within people who are trying to make the world better. And sometimes those divisions can seem impassable, uncrossable. And I hope that, to the degree that we can, all those that envision a better world can find ways to come together, even when we disagree, find the points of connection, find the points of common action, and have some kind of basic fundamental respect for our shared humanity that can help carry us through.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems so relevant to what's going on right now. And I wonder about what degree of shared goals or values alignment is necessary for that to work. Like if I'm in a discussion about, let's say, immigration with people who have like really diametrically opposite views, it seems like it's going to be a little harder. Like I mean, it's what I want. It's like I want to be able to never forget my fundamental respect of their humanity, and to have that inform the whole conversation. It just seems harder to me than if it's like tactics on nonviolent civil disobedience.
Look, I think it's absolutely harder. And I'm not going to be so pie in the sky as to suggest that that with the right ethic, we could or should have meaningful connections with people that hold any possible belief. I don't think that's true. I actually think that there are people who are so fundamentally wrong-headed about basic questions, like, for example, the fact that skin color, doesn't denote a hierarchy of humanity, right? Or people who believe profoundly in sort of sexist patriarchal views of male female relationships, certain kinds of religious chauvinism, right? I mean, there's a lot of religious bigotry in this world that is so deeply held that I don't think it would be very useful for us to sit down with someone who's a hardcore Islamophobe, for example, and try to convince them that, in fact, the vast majority of Muslims, like the vast majority of most people in most faiths, are beautiful human beings that are trying to pursue, truth and justice in their own ways. There are a lot of people in this world, sadly, that I don't think are worth our time or effort. Doesn't mean we should try to kill them, right? I still think that there's a degree to which the nonviolent ethic is appropriate in many situations, even when talking with someone isn't necessarily appropriate. But then it becomes hard to know, well, when is someone beyond the pale, and what, what's the utility of talking to someone that, to take your example, feels very differently about questions of immigration, but maybe isn't a hardcore white supremacist, and maybe is open to finding other forms of connection. and perhaps through time, and maybe not necessarily through talking, but maybe through shared experiences. Just for example, hanging out with some immigrants and getting to know them and making music with them or cooking with them. And if someone could be called into those kinds of situations, I like to hope that most human beings are able to change. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's a whole lot harder. And even in my own life, I mean, I have friends, particularly family friends and members of my family who I don't talk about everything with. I try to avoid politics as much as possible because it's just not going to be useful for anybody, right? I mean, the whole issue of how do you talk about things at the Thanksgiving dinner with your crazy Uncle Billy? Sometimes it's better not to talk to crazy Uncle Billy about these things because it's not going to produce anything. But I also hope for myself and, for my kids as they get older, I hope that we're not so risk averse and so fearful of confrontation that we aren't willing to try to address difficult subjects with people. And I think there are many, many contexts in which people actually aren't as different and aren't as opposed as they might think they are. And that, in fact, there can be a lot of commonality on a lot of issues, or people don't expect that, especially in our country today, right? I mean, in the US today, there's so much purposeful, manufactured disagreement, right? I mean, it's politically useful on both ends of the political spectrum to play up differences and to get people afraid of the other side and to feel that there's such deep division. And yet, right, when you poll Americans on many issues, you find actually we're not that far apart on many things, right? And there's a lot of potential connection or commonality. Some issues I even find politically hopeful these days, like, for example, drug policy. I think our country's moving in a positive, my opinion, positive direction in recognizing the futility of the so-called war on drugs. And exactly where we'll go, it still remains unclear, but I feel like most Americans are on the side of progress as I see it on that issue and are coming together in that way. And I do hope that on issues where there is more fierce disagreement, like, for example, immigration, that there's the possibility of changing hearts and minds over time. Right. What's the story? I don't remember the place, but in rural Tennessee, when the immigration services showed up and arrested large numbers of undocumented people, many of the documented residents of that community, people that would stereotypically be seen as falling on the red political spectrum, anti-immigrant camp and whatnot, they rallied in support because they'd gotten to know these people and their kids were going to school together and they shopped at the same supermarket. And so this had no longer become an issue of immigration. It had become an issue of that family that I know. And I know that father and mother are good people and they're here trying to work, trying to get food for their families. And I still have hope that we can come across these divides if we're able to find ways for people to engage each other as human beings.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I really enjoy being able to call upon you like this. So,
I
thank
love
you.
it, Encore. I love
It's
it.
great.
It's always a joy to talk with you.
Yeah, and it's
And
just
I feel like if I can, I feel like you are in your own community, right? In Squim, you're creating a kind of beloved community, to use the phrase that was often popular within the civil rights movement. You're bringing people together through music, for example, right? Bringing people together through, shared food, right? Every time you bring a loaf of bread to someone, you're making the world a better place. And, the way geography and politics align in our country, it might not be easy for you to bring loaves of bread to anti-immigrant zealots very often. But when we can, I think doing small acts of kindness that cut across the divides in our society is a beautiful thing. And I think I think you're already doing that in many meaningful ways. I think we're all called to start small in our own communities, our own neighborhoods, to forge connections with our neighbors and with others in ways that help us see across the divides that are so prevalent in our world right now.
Yeah, thank you for the encouragement, the vote of support, and it's true for me that for years I've had these like big hopes of what we can accomplish as humans and how we can transform our societies, but it can be so disappointing and discouraging to have the hopes without acting every day in whatever way is possible. And I haven't found a really direct way of affecting the Middle East peace process through my daily life. But there's
Yeah.
things that I think in some way may lead there, right?
Yeah. 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 Well, one of the things that I admire about Gandhi is that he, for most of his adult life, had an ashram community where he tried to live out his ideals on a very small scale with a very small number of other like-minded people. And at the same time, was always trying to affect change on a larger scale. And he would go back and forth. And sometimes he would spend years actually doing very little on the larger scale. For one reason or another, it seemed there wasn't any path to creating change on the national, international level. So he focused in on his ashram community. And I think that's fine. At least for me as a human being, I feel called to try to do both. But there's certainly times where the larger picture seems overwhelming or hopeless, or I just don't know where to find my way in. And it feels more meaningful to focus super small, right, on my kids or my family. And then maybe sometimes a little bit larger, my neighborhood or my school, or maybe my city. And then other times where I feel called to try to get engaged in some small way with national, international politics. So all of these things are connected, of course, right? And I think as long as we don't wall ourselves off entirely from the world, which I do think is a mistake, or forget the importance of trying to live out our values in our small everyday moments, which is also a mistake. And in fact, a mistake that I would say Gandhi himself fell into often, right? I mean, he was sometimes so focused on these larger struggles and so focused on his own personal path that he could be a pretty terrible father and not an especially good husband. And, you know, I don't put myself on any kind of a critical pedestal to look down and pass judgment on anyone else. But I do try to learn from the fact that even someone like Gandhi, who really did strive to live out his values, struggled often to be good to the people in his immediate circle. And I try my best to not fall into that. Although, my goodness, you know, every week I'd say there's at least 1 or 2 days where I don't do a good job of stopping work early enough. And so when the kids come home from school, I'm still half there. And whatever work anxieties, you know, I check email at the last minute and there's some pesky email that comes in. And then when my daughter, you know, rejects the grilled cheese sandwich that I made for her because I didn't use the right cheese or the right bread or whatnot, it's much harder for me to be patient. And sometimes I am not patient. And I know that some of it is I'm still playing out that email in my head, right? And this is Nico Slate in this small, tiny world, right? I mean, someone like Gandhi is dealing with massive hundreds of thousands of people, the destiny of an entire country. So I'm not going to criticize him for sometimes being a pretty bad father, but I do try to learn from that in order to say, okay, well, whatever my work stuff is that matters to me so much, I'm going to try to wrap that up by 4 o'clock so that when the kids come home at 4:30, I'm able to be patient and ready for all the challenges they're going to bring, because they're going to bring their own exhaustion and frustrations and, willpower, etc. So I don't know. I mean, how do you balance work and life? Because I know you're similar to me, Ankur, in that your work could go on forever, right? You're not working a 9-to-5 job here. And so how do you make sure to carve out space to be, the best Ankur you can be in all of these worlds, even when they're jostling up against each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the two things that come to mind maybe there's three. One is I do a pretty good job of remembering like what I really want, my priorities. So if that gets confused, then it's like this little person coming to me is just an annoyance. But recently, and I think Jasmine was in the hospital a year and a half ago, and that just really helped me remember my priorities. And now like every time I see her, I'm just like, wow, you are an incredible gift to be in my life, and it's really helpful to have that. Otherwise it's just so easy for it to be like, oh my God, you're annoying me right now. So that's one, is that kind of deeper remembering. And I say it out loud to her every day, like before she goes to bed. Just I make sure that I say it out loud for me and for her to remember. So that's one. The second is kind of what you said, this time of transition. Like if your kids are going to be home at 4:30 and your goal is to finish work at 4:30, your host. Because we need it's just like, I mean, it's like that whole poster when we were kids of everything I need to know about life I learned in kindergarten. It's like there's so much truth in that. Like we need a little bit of warning to make the transitions, just like they do in elementary schools and kindergarten. And so I try to give myself 20 minutes or more between when I finish my work and when I go pick her up, whether it's on a bike or in a car or whatever. So that's helpful. And then the third is really good hygiene with devices. So, and kids are great at noticing when you're not clean about that. They'll complain, they'll imitate you, they'll just, and it's just like, and I have an identity. I have an identity around not being hooked to this device. So when she reminds me of it, it stings. And so I want to preserve that identity of being like, oh yeah, he's not the dad that's always attached to his phone. So I try to not, not have that near me when I'm hanging out with her.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned devices, because to return to your initial question about anger, I feel as someone who's actually not that connected to my phone, I'm a bit of a Luddite. My sense is that what cell phones and other kinds of technology have done to people on an emotional level is to flatten out in some ways the emotional spectrum and to lock people into a narrower range of emotion. So there's still joy, but it's not, and maybe again, this is maybe an outsider's view, but it's muted joy. It's not the joy of performing live music or climbing a mountain, right? I mean, like getting that little dopamine hit of clicking this thing or that thing. I get it that there's some human satisfaction involved in that process, but it just doesn't seem as full-throated as what one can get from engaging the world beyond. And similarly, I feel like the negative emotions that are so often attached to technology, things like insecurity and anxiety, right? Is my Instagram feed as interesting as that person's Instagram feed? Those are negative emotions, but I also don't know that it is the same kind of deep anger that one could experience in a direct interaction with other human beings in the world. And so maybe, I don't know, but I wonder if to go back to your initial question about anger and the role of anger and nonviolent change. I mean, I think part of what is called for is actually tapping into the deepest parts of our experience and not getting trapped in that kind of boring middle, right? Because if you get trapped in the boring middle, you might avoid the depths of anger, but you also are unlikely to go out and join any kind of effort to make the world a better place, because you're just stuck in that cycle of, okay, I have to do this, I have to do that. And I'll indict myself. Again, I'm not super addicted to some things that others are addicted to, but I'm not good with email. I have a hard time not answering emails, even if they don't need to be answered. In fact, I have this bad habit of deleting an email even though I haven't been able to respond to it yet because I hate having it in my inbox, and then going and making a note in my calendar to go back and put it back in my inbox later. It's all this extra work I do just because I don't like having emails in my inbox, right? That's not healthy. But it's, it is what it is. It's a form of perfectionism. And I find that if I spend a day where a lot of my day is on email, it ends up feeling just kind of like a lost day. It's like I didn't fully live the life in the fullness of what it can be. And if I have a really intense, difficult argument, which these days usually involves my beloved children, one way or another, right? And I try not to be confrontational or angry with them, but I also try to express my emotions with them because I want them to feel comfortable doing that too. Even when it's a difficult interaction, in the end of the day, it feels like we're alive today. We're human beings in the world. And part of what I think pulled many people into social movements is that they felt authentic in a way that most human beings crave. It felt like, for once, I'm actually doing something that matters in the world and living life in a way that is calling out not just the best in me, but calling out the truest in me. It's going back to satyagraha, right? I mean, what does it mean to pursue the truth? Some of it, I think, is to embrace the full spectrum of what it means to be a human being in the world. And that certainly, at least for me, and I think for most people, sometimes includes anger.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I love how I called you as a professional expert, and you were so willing to get into the personal implications of it and have that be brought back around to satyagraha and your expertise. So I really appreciate how you wove both of those together, and you're present for both of those facets of your life for us. Thank you. Nico.
My pleasure, Encore. It's always a joy to speak with you.
Hi everyone, this is Martin San, producer, editor, and sound designer for the 10,000 Heroes Joe. I just wanted to take a minute to thank our guest for joining us, and also thank you for listening. 10,000 Heroes is brought to you by Momentum Lab. This is the team. Pierre does our artwork, DJ Plainview composed our theme music, and I handle all the editing and sound design. And now, we are closing down this episode with a word from our main sponsor, who also happens to be our host, Anko.
Hey everybody, thanks again for listening. If you like this episode, there's two things I want you to do. One, introduce me to the most inspiring person you know so I can have them on the show. And two, take the next step towards us hanging out in person. Maybe that's signing up for the newsletter. Maybe that's attending an upcoming in-person or virtual event. What I'm trying to do here is destroy the basic one-to-many nature of this medium, podcast, entertainment, and replace it with something that actually builds connections between people, the beloved community, getting closer together, understanding each other, one conversation at a time. So, join me. Bye!